So first of all, the cell membrane actually goes by a couple of different names. You may also hear it referred to as the plasma membrane or the plasma lemma. Now, the plasma membrane also refers to membranes that surround other membrane-bound organelles. So for example, the membrane that surrounds the mitochondria and the membrane that surrounds the endoplasmic reticulum, those are also plasma membranes. But the cell membrane is just more specifically the plasma membrane that is surrounding the cell. And the plasma lemma is just another term that also refers to that kind of plasma membrane. So, first of all, why do cells need a cell membrane? Well, you can think of the cell membrane as almost like a skin between the inside environment and the outside environment of the cell. So inside the cell, you have fluid called the ICF, and that's our intracellular fluid. So that ICF stands for intracellular fluid. And outside the cell, you have the ECF, which stands for the extracellular fluid. And then this line that I drew here is representing the cell membrane. Now, different substances have to be able to enter and leave the cell, but there are other substances that maybe should not be able to get into the cell. And so that's kind of where the cell membrane comes into play. So it's kind of like a skin in the sense that some stuff can cross through it, other stuff cannot. And if you think about things that maybe need to be able to get across the cell membrane, we're talking about things like water, carbon dioxide, oxygen, maybe some ions such as sodium and potassium. Also things like glucose, maybe amino acids. So these are all things that, depending on the cell, may need to be able to get across the cell membrane. And we'll talk about how the cell membrane of some cells allows some stuff in, but the cell membrane of other cells might not allow the same stuff in. So we'll get there. But essentially, we just need to kind of focus on the fact that we need to be able to get nutrients into the cell. And we need to be able to get things like waste products out of the cell. There are also things that a cell produces that it also needs to be able to kind of export to other things. So, for example, some cells export proteins. And so the proteins are made inside the cell, but then they have to be able to leave the cell membrane in order to go into the body fluids or the bloodstream and be delivered to other parts of the body. I often draw the cell membrane as just being a circle around the cell, but this is a very, very simplified kind of drawing of a cell membrane, because in reality, what's happening in this line here is that it's containing a lot of other molecules that actually make up that cell membrane. And the primary molecule that makes up the cell membrane is something called a phospholipid. And this is kind of the fancy molecular drawing here, but we oftentimes draw it as kind of a cartoon with a head and some tails. All right, so the head part up here is the phosphate head. And then the tails are made up of fatty acids. So these are the lipid tails that are fatty acids. And kind of the key thing, kind of the difference, if you will, between these two parts of the molecule are whether they are hydrophobic or hydrophilic, because the heads, the phosphate heads up here, are hydrophilic. Remember, hydrophilic means that it is attracted to water, whereas the lipid tails are hydrophobic, meaning that they are repelled by water, so they don't like to be in contact with water. And this this is really important because it basically determines what can cross the cell membrane and what can't. And it also determines what the cell membrane looks like. So on the next slide, I believe we're going to take a look at that cell structure a little bit more, or the cell membrane structure a little more closely. The cell membrane, as we mentioned, is primarily made up of phospholipids, and more specifically, these phospholipids form something called a bilayer. And bi, that bi, means two. So we're really talking about two layers of phospholipids that are making up the cell membrane. Now, if you remember, the tails are hydrophobic. So we can kind of show that down here. These are the hydrophobic tails. And remember that something that's hydrophobic is going to be repelled by water, or turned away by water. So if we have extracellular fluid outside the cell and intracellular fluid inside the cell, then those tails are going to be repelled by that water. So they're actually going to turn away from the fluids and they turn in towards each other. So this is the hydrophobic tail of one phospholipid. These are the hydrophobic tails of another phospholipid. And you can see in this picture here, this is kind of showing you more of a three-dimensional look at what this phospholipid bilayer looks like. So this is looking at like a sphere that's been cut in half. And you can see that the hydrophobic tails are going towards the inside here. And the hydrophilic heads are on the surface. So these are the hydrophilic phosphate heads. And then the liquid would be, you would have the intracellular fluid inside here where I'm drawing the blue. And then you would have extracellular fluid, out here, kind of outside the cell. Now, the cell membrane is made up primarily of this phospholipid bilayer. So you can see in this kind of drawing of it here, you can see that this is our phospholipid bilayer. So we've got our phosphate heads on either side and our lipid tails in the middle. But the cell membrane isn't just made up of the phospholipid bilayer. There are also other components that are embedded in it. So looking at this picture down here, the kind of the things in blue are proteins. And you can see that there are different types of proteins, and we'll talk about these different types on future slides. There are also some carbohydrates that are kind of sticking up off of the outside of the cell membrane. And these make up part of something called the glycocalyx. So we'll talk about that a little bit more on a future slide as well. But the glycocalyx is primarily made up of carbohydrates, also linked to some other material. So for example, a glycolipid is a carbohydrate that is attached to a lipid. And a glycoprotein is a carbohydrate attached to a protein. And then we'll also talk about this substance known as cholesterol. And so you can see these little cholesterol molecules kind of embedded in the phospholipid bilayer here as well. Now, we often hear of cholesterol as being a bad thing. And if you don't have cholesterol homeostasis, then it can be a bad thing because there is such thing as having too much cholesterol or not enough. But we do need some cholesterol, and this is one of the reasons why we need it. We need it for our cell membranes. So let's start by talking a little bit more about these cell membrane proteins. So these are the things that are kind of drawn in blue on our picture down here. And there are kind of two main classes of proteins. The integral proteins are ones that cross all the way, or they span or go all the way across the phospholipid bilayer. So you can see these proteins here where they are touching both the inside and the outside of the cell. These are our integral proteins. And you might also see them referred to as transmembrane because they span the membrane. They go to both sides of the membrane. Now, peripheral proteins are located on just one side of the cell membrane. So they might be on just the inside, or they might be on just the outside of the cell membrane. So you can see here that there's one inside here, and then there's one kind of sticking out the outside here. And we'll talk about how the different types of proteins have different functions. So starting by talking about one type of integral protein, and remember these are the proteins that go all across the cell membrane. So they touch the extracellular fluid and they touch the intracellular fluid. And one, I guess they're all really important, but one really important are these transport proteins. And these are proteins that help to allow certain substances to cross the cell membrane. So remember we talked about how we've got the cell membrane and how there are certain things that need to be able to kind of cross over and then other things that can't cross. And partially this ability to cross the cell membrane has to do with whether a cell has these particular transport proteins. And we're going to talk a little bit more about these processes when we talk about membrane transport. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how these proteins are involved in things like diffusion and active transport. Some of these integral proteins act as receptors, and a receptor is kind of like a lock that a key can bind to lock it or unlock it. So for example, you don't have to memorize all the details of this image right here, but this is just showing you that we have a transmembrane protein right here. So we've got our integral protein. And on the extracellular side, so the extracellular fluid here, we have a kind of a receptor area. So you can see right here, this is going to be our receptor. And then this little green spot here. So this is, sorry, I wrote over it, but this is epinephrine. And epinephrine is, it's kind of classified as a neurotransmitter and also a hormone. But this is basically like the key that can unlock the receptor. So when epinephrine comes in and binds to this receptor, it activates a series of enzymes. So this is called an enzyme cascade. So receptors are one way that parts of the body communicate with other parts of the body. You'll learn more about how these work when you learn about the endocrine system and the nervous system. We can also see in this image over here that sometimes those receptors open up one of those channels that we talked about on the previous slide. So in this case, we have something called a ligand. Okay, so once again, this kind of green ball here. And that's also what this epinephrine over here is called, is a ligand. And the ligand is kind of like the key that binds to the receptor, which is the lock. So when this ligand binds to the receptor, all right, let me go ahead and label that receptor spot right there. What it does is it opens this channel. So you can see here that this channel is closed. But once this binds, that channel opens up. And once that channel opens up, it allows something else. It allows something else to cross through the transport protein. So it's kind of like opening a door or a hallway so that something can make it into the cell. So the ligand in this case, it might be something like a neurotransmitter, or it might be a hormone. And the thing crossing the cell membrane might be something like sodium. So it might be something like an ion. Maybe it's potassium, maybe it's calcium. There's different options for what could be crossing the cell membrane. Integral proteins might also help to just anchor the cell in place. So we haven't really talked too much about this thing called the extracellular matrix, but basically you have cells, and surrounding the cells you have this kind of matrix of proteins, and the matrix might take on different shapes and it might be made of different types of proteins, but you can kind of think of it as this mesh that the cells are held in place by. So your cells aren't just free floating around inside your body, or at least most of them aren't. And so they're embedded in this structure called the extracellular matrix, or the ECM. So these proteins can kind of act as like anchors to help to attach the cell to those proteins in the extracellular matrix in order to hold it in place. Some integral proteins are involved in cell-to-cell recognition, and this can come into play especially with our immune cells or our immune response. So, for example, let's say that this is a cell that's supposed to be in your body. So this one right here, so this is a good cell that's supposed to be there. And this is maybe an immune cell. And so immune cells have to be able to recognize that this is a good cell so that it does not attack. So you can see that there's almost like a little receptor here that it can kind of scan this part of the cell membrane that's sticking out, and this would be the glycocalyx, which we haven't really talked about yet, but we'll get to that. But this immune cell can basically scan this glycocalyx, and that kind of gives it the information it needs to be like, okay, the cell is okay, do not attack. All right. Now, if it were a different cell, so let's say it was maybe a bacteria cell and its glycocalyx looks different. And so this might be a situation where this is a bad cell. So if the receptor doesn't match this little glycocalyx sticking out here, then the immune cell would then attack and destroy that bacteria cell. Integral proteins can also work as a way to essentially attach cells to each other. So far we've talked a lot about cells kind of just being these independent units, but in reality, cells often work together, and they work together to form these things called tissues. So tissues are just cells that are working together to fulfill a function or carry out a function. And so in order to do so, they have to be able to be connected to each other. And sometimes those connections are just involved in holding them together. Other times it allows the cells to communicate with each other. So we're going to talk about these different types of intercellular junctions on the next couple slides. The first type of intercellular junction we're going to talk about are things called tight junctions. And tight junctions are these proteins that essentially sew the cell membranes of adjacent cells together, kind of like a thread on like a seam of a pair of, or a piece of clothing. So if we have these, I just drew 3 kind of cube-shaped cells here, and these cells might be essentially almost like sewn together by these tight junctions. And so these tight junctions, they help to hold the cells together, but also helps to create a watertight seal. So we see tight junctions in things like the epidermis of the skin. So your skin forms a solid sheet that's acting as a barrier. And so kind of materials that are outside the cell, so maybe something like a bacterium that shouldn't get deeper in the body, it's not going to be able to pass through those tight junctions. So it's going to stay on the surface of the skin and ultimately be killed maybe when you wash your hands. Another type of connecting intercellular junction is something called a desmosome. And desmosomes are kind of like tight junctions, except for it's more like a button as compared to a seam. So for example, if we have cells that are next to each other, they might be connected by these desmosomes. They're kind of like little buttons holding the cell membranes together. But they don't create a watertight seal. So stuff can still get kind of in between those cells to get from one side of the tissue to the other side of the tissue. One thing about desmosomes is that they are stronger than tight junctions. So they're a really strong connection. They just don't form that watertight seal that tight junctions do. We see desmosomes between cardiac muscle cells in the heart. And this is because they really help to hold the cells together under mechanical stress. So imagine your heart is kind of like a water balloon and it's constantly compressing liquid. Well, if it didn't have a tight kind of connection holding it together, those cells would rip apart every time they contracted, and that would obviously be bad. So the desmosomes help to hold those cells together so that they don't come apart during the contraction of the heart. The third type of intercellular junction that we are taking a look at are gap junctions. And gap junctions actually form like little passageways between one cell and an adjacent cell. So let me see if I can draw this here. There we go. So as you can see that I'm drawing here, it almost forms like a little doorway or hallway between adjacent cells. And that's so if there's something in one cell, it can be shared with the adjacent cell without having to go outside of the cell. So this is kind of like if you go stay at a hotel and there's a door that connects two rooms in the hotel so that you can move from one hotel room to the other hotel room without having to go out in the hallway. That's kind of like what this gap junction is. So whatever information one cell gets, the other cell that it's attached to gets it very, very quickly. And this is also something that we see a lot in cardiac muscle cells. And that's because your heart is made up of a whole bunch of these cardiac muscle cells, and they have to be able to work together. So if one cell gets the signal to contract, it needs to be able to share that signal with all of its adjacent cells very, very quickly. And so these gap junctions are primarily involved in communication. So it allows one cell to quickly communicate with cells that it's connected to, and then that allows these cells to contract at the same time to work together to pump the blood through your body. Peripheral proteins are ones that are only found on either the outside of the cell membrane or the inside of the cell membrane, but they don't cross the entire phospholipid bilayer like the integral proteins do. So for example, you can see this protein down here is only touching one side of the cell membrane. So it's really only touching the intracellular fluid here and not the extracellular fluid. Now these peripheral proteins can serve a couple of different functions. One is that they can be enzymes. So remember that enzymes are substances that catalyze chemical reactions. So that just means that these are things that can speed up chemical reactions. They can also be attachment points for the cytoskeleton. So you can see in this picture down here that it's showing the cytoskeleton as these kind of fibers or strings here. And the cytoskeleton is primarily made out of these fibrous proteins. And so the peripheral proteins help to anchor the cell membrane to that cytoskeleton. Peripheral proteins are also involved in helping to give the cell identification. So you can kind of think of this identification as almost like a name tag. So kind of identifying the cell as belonging to an individual. So it's kind of like, hi, I belong to Lauren. So all of my cells have an identifier that identifies them as belonging to me. Now, someone else's cells are going to have a different name tag or a different identifier. Also, pathogens like bacteria have a different cell identification on them. And this comes into play with the immune system. And we're going to actually talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the carbohydrates, because these proteins and carbohydrates work together to form something called the glycocalyx. And the glycocalyx is kind of the fancy name for these cellular identification name tags. So you can see here, now we're talking about the carbohydrates associated with the cell membrane, and this is a good segue to that glycocalyx that we were talking about on the previous slide. So the glycocalyx is technically called the sugar coat, but there are oftentimes other molecules that are part of that. For example, you might have a sugar molecule, so glyco has to do with sugar. But you might have some molecules that have sugars attached to proteins or sugars attached to lipids, which are the fats. Remember, glyco means sugar, but the lipids mean fat, and the glycoproteins are a sugar that are connected to a protein. And altogether, they make up this glycocalyx. Remember, the glycocalyx is kind of the name tag or the identifier for the cell. And different cells have a different glycocalyx, and that includes different types of cells in the body, but it also includes the difference between one person and another person, or the difference between an animal cell and I should say maybe like a dog cell and a human cell. We all have these different glycocalyx. And these glycocalyxes are involved in helping to, once again, give that cell the identification. And it's really important for the immune system because, for example, if you have a cell that belongs to you and it's got a certain glycocalyx that's kind of sticking off of it here, this glycocalyx helps immune cells to identify those cells as okay. Like your immune cells, so we'll say self-immune cell, know to not attack your own cells because it can kind of scan this glycocalyx or read it. Now, if you have a different glycocalyx, let's say we've got a bacterium here, and this bacterium has a glycocalyx that looks different. So it's made up of different glycoproteins and glycolipids. And this is something that your immune cell will identify that it should attack. And in doing so, that's how our immune system knows to attack and kill off the kind of the bad stuff, like the pathogens, but not attack the cells that are supposed to be there. This also comes into play with the donated organs. So there's something called rejection. And this happens when the immune system attacks an organ that's been donated, because even though someone might be really nice and they might donate a kidney to you, unfortunately, your immune system doesn't know that the donated kidney is supposed to be there. Your immune system just recognizes that it has the wrong glycocalyx, which means that the immune system is going to attack the organ. And this is what leads to failure of donated organs. And so people that receive an organ donation, they have to take immunosuppression drugs in order to prevent this rejection from happening. So immunosuppression decreases the activity of these immune cells, which it's good for the organ because it keeps the body from rejecting the organ, but it's bad overall for the person because then it also lowers their ability to fight off other infections. So it's kind of a balance between suppressing the immune system enough to not attack the organ, but not suppressing it so much that the person might die from something simple like the common cold. Cholesterol is another component of the cell membrane. And remember that cholesterol is classified as a lipid, and more specifically, it's a steroid. And we typically think of cholesterol in modern times, we think of it as something that's bad because if you have too much of the wrong kind of cholesterol, it can increase your risk of stroke and heart attack and kind of other problems there. But in reality, we actually need some cholesterol in our body. So it's all about that homeostasis that we've talked about before, where we need the right amount of the right type of cholesterol in order to stay healthy. But if you have too much or too little, then you'll get sick and your body won't function properly. One reason why we need cholesterol in our body is because it helps to kind of maintain the fluidity of the cell membrane. So that means that you can kind of think of this as the flexibility of the cell membrane. So we want the cell membrane to be not too rigid, but also not too flexible. So there's a balance, and the cholesterol helps to maintain that flexibility and that fluidity. The cell membrane is known as a fluid mosaic. So a mosaic means that it's made up of a lot of different things, so several different components. And the fluid part means that those components can move around. So the cell membrane is flexible, and even within the phospholipid bilayer, things like these proteins can move around. So they're not stuck in one general location. And this is actually a video that I can't show using the program that I'm using to record this. But if you go open up the Google slide and look at the slides that way, then you can actually press that play button to play the video and watch it. So it's a short video, just a couple seconds, but it helps to explain this fluid mosaic model, and it helps to show how things move around within the plane of the phospholipids.